Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world of Kabbalah, lesson 4. This afternoon and evening's lesson is generously sponsored, or co-sponsored, I should say, by Mr. Ron Rohr, who just arrived. Welcome, Ron. And Mickey Butnick. And the title of today's lesson is The World of Chaos. Exciting lesson title. And I want to take a moment now to apologize. I don't think really to anybody on the Zoom here, maybe, but definitely to some people that are going to be watching the recording, to everybody who's watching the recording. I know that the recording for lesson 3 did not go out yet. I wish I could take personal responsibility for it, but I don't. Last week I was in the JLI headquarters, as most of you know, and that's where I gave the lesson from. So the recording is still stuck there. I've been trying ever since then to get somebody to go over to the computer and just kind of upload it from there, and hopefully sooner than later we will have the recording for lesson 3 out. But my apologies for that. But for today, we are going to dive into the world of chaos. I know a lot of you are very much resonating with this lesson already, just from the title. So it feels like my life, the world of chaos. So until today, we've been examining the human soul and its parallels with Seder Hishtalshelut, or the order of devolution, the human soul versus the way it is in the way that God creates. At every single moment, God recreates the world. Okay. Today, we are going to introduce a new understanding of the human soul, and that's because we're going to explore a fascinatingly underexplored world or realm or dimension, whichever word you want to use, in Seder Hishtalshelut, in the order of devolution. So let's begin with an exercise, and I should say that I am not going to ask you to share these results. It should be on page 111 in your student textbook. And essentially what we're asking you is to give us a yes or no answer to each question. Okay, so question number 1, I am a selfish person. Are you comfortable saying yes to that question, or are you comfortable saying no to that question? And if you were very comfortable saying, for example, that I am a selfish person, you say no, what about the opposite? What if I ask you, I am not a selfish person? Are you very comfortable saying yes? There's a good chance that most of us are probably uncomfortable answering any of those questions in black or white, because we fall somewhere in the gray area in between. Am I right? Let's move along. Some things are more, at times I really only care about myself and my well-being. Is that yes or no? Some things are more significant than my existence. Yes or no? I would never knowingly do something to hurt another person, or I know that I've hurt others in pursuit of my goals. There's not necessarily opposites. They can both be true. I sometimes feel glad when someone else fails, or I do not want to rejoice over someone else's troubles. Again, they can both be yes, they can both be no. And I weigh short-term gains against the long-term harm they may invite. And if you answer to that one yes, then I'm going to ask you right now about your weight. Because if you claim that you weigh short-term gains against the long-term harm that they may invite, then you would never eat that extra cookie, right? You would never have that extra sandwich or that one more helping of dinner if it was a good dinner, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not going to ask anybody to share their answers, but what I do want to ask is for a raise of hand with the following questions. Are you ready? Did you find it difficult to give a definitive answer to these questions? Raise of hand. Most people. Why? Because if I tell you to say you're either selfish or not selfish, you're like, what kind of question is that? I'm not selfish, but I wouldn't say I'm completely selfless, right? I'm somewhere in between. Here's another question. Did you find yourself giving contradictory yes answers to two opposing statements? I could have said, yes, I am a selfish person, and yes, I am not a selfish person, right? Very contradictory. I think the reason that we struggle with a test like this is because human beings are not simple. Human beings are not black and white. Human beings are complex creatures. On the one hand, most of us aspire to be altruistic, we aspire to be selfless, we aspire to be there for others, etc. And yet, on the other hand, we're very much in tune with the fact that we have selfish drives and hedonistic instincts, right, which drive us to do things maybe that we're not so proud of, or that we're not so proud of from turning to other people's perspectives, right? But we are in the moment we do them because whether they give us pleasure or because we enjoy them or what have you. So Kabbalah would explain that this conflict is rooted in the fact that we have two souls. Two souls. Jonathan, if you can read it for us, please. This comes from Tanya, from the first Chabad Rebbe. It is text 1 in your books on page 112.
The first of our souls originates in non-holiness. This soul resides in our bloodstream to vitalize our body. It is the source of all our negative character traits, as well as those positive traits that come naturally to us, such as compassion and kindness. A Jew's second soul is an actual part of the transcendent God.
So this idea, what I would call the dual soul model, the idea that we are actually a little bit more schizophrenic than we like to give ourselves credit for, comes from the Kabbalists, comes all the way back from Rabbi Chaim Vital, the student of the Arizal, without getting into all the Kabbalistic origins to this, but it's been most popularized by a book called the Tanya, what Chabad Hasidim would call the Bible of Chabad Hasidism. The first soul is often called the Nefesh HaBahamit, the animal soul. Why is it called the animal soul? It's because of a quality that it has in common with animal life. This is the part of us, this drives the part of us that makes us feel animalistic in nature, right? Now, this drives us, for example, to want to continue to exist, to survive, right? It therefore drives all of our eating, our drinking, our sleeping, right? It also drives any gratification that we have in our lives. Now, all of this may sound very, very negative, but actually, the animal soul has very positive traits as well. It's just that those positive traits will be self-oriented. For example, it may do kind things, right? Maybe you're familiar with somebody like this, or maybe you're familiar with the fact that sometimes you do this, that you do something kind, but actually there's something deeper at play here, a selfish interest that you have. It does end up resulting in a kindness to someone else, but it can still be, so that can be a positive trait, but it comes from a self-oriented place. And finally, there we go. Of course, it leads to immoral behavior sometimes when we do what we want at the expense of someone else. And this, I think, is more obviously connected to the animalistic drive. And this is what we call the Nefesh HaBahamit, and it's our first key term for today. Nefesh HaBahamit, the animal soul. But we also have another soul. What is that soul? Jonathan read it for us. A Jew's second soul is an actual part of the transcendent God. This soul, as per its name, the only thing that it wants is actually not itself, not its own survival. All it wants is to transcend itself, to have a relationship with God, or even a relationship with other souls through which to have a relationship with God. The deeper you get into Hasidic parlance and the Hasidic style, the Hasidic demands of life, you learn that actually a relationship with other souls is directly related with a relationship with God. You can't have one without the other. But in other words, it is completely mission-driven. It is probably the one that I would say most evokes the words of John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. It actually turns out that John F. Kennedy was not the first one to use a statement like that. About 150 years before John F. Kennedy, the Alter Rebbe, the author of text 1 that we're in the middle of unpacking here, expressed a similar idea to a formerly wealthy chassid who came in complaining that he doesn't have enough money, doesn't have enough for this, doesn't have enough for that, doesn't have enough for this, doesn't have enough for that. So the Alter Rebbe turned to him and in a little bit of a sharp way said to him, "You have told me everything that you need, but what you are needed for, of that you make no mention." Right? This is well documented, an old statement from the Alter Rebbe. Why? In other words, he was giving him over that for being too animal soul oriented. You're too survival oriented. You're not focusing on what you're needed for, on transcending yourself, on being there for a mission, on being godly, if you will. Okay. Now here's the question. So and that's Nefesh HaElokit, that's the godly soul. Now here's the question: which of these two souls is stronger? Right. So actually, the answer can be found in its very name. An animal, one of the things that an animal actually contains in even more abundance than a human being is brute strength, right? And similarly, the animal soul is significantly more robust than the godly soul. Let's see this in text 2. Phil, if I can ask you to read for us, please.
The ox's strength produces abundant crops. That is to say, the animal soul's drive is more potent than the godly soul's drive.
Thank you, Phil. Folks, this is the reason why when it's 40 degrees outside and raining on January 1st, Chabad of Pasadena will struggle to get a minyan at 6:30 in the morning. But at that same exact time on Colorado Boulevard, you'll have millions of people, rain or shine, lining up on the by the red line and then the blue line, etc., getting ready to watch the Rose Parade. And why a few hours later, when we will be struggling to get people to come to a lunch and learn class, the Rose Bowl will have 90,000 seats that are filled to capacity waiting for a game. Why? Because the drive of the animal soul is stronger than the drive of the godly soul. This is also why if you go to a good restaurant, you have a good steak, everybody makes sure to take a picture, right? Take a picture, post it on social media, right? But you come to shul every single day, very, very few people post on social media about that, right? It doesn't get as many likes. Why? Because the animal soul's drive is stronger. Now, these two souls are always in competition. They're in competition for control over what the Alter Rebbe would call the small city that is our life, our hearts, our minds, our drives. Now, at this point, I want to call your attention back here to these things. Remember these? Remember these maps? These maps are a little bit misleading. Why? You see, because on one side it has it has the godly version of it. On the other side it has the human version of it. But here's a key factor. Here's a key factor. We talk about the 10 Sefirot on a human level as being the 10 soul powers. But the truth is, ready for your mind to be blown? It turns out there are 20 soul powers. Why? Because there are two souls, and each soul is made up of 10 soul powers. So everything we learned about in all of the lessons up until today has been there's really double. So think about, for example, where are we here? Yeah. So think about, for example, the 3 garments, which we introduced in lesson number 1. Remember those? Thought, speech, and action. There's thought, speech, and action of the godly soul, thought, speech, and action of the animal soul. Remember the 10 attributes, the 10 soul powers? 10 for the animal soul, 10 for the godly soul. Remember the yearning for desire, right? The deep level of desire that we learned about last week, a deep sense of desire that can actually manipulate everything else. Also, one exists for the animal soul, one exists for the godly soul. And furthermore, when we said in earlier lessons, for example, remember the words Tahorahi, the purity, the simple purity of the godly soul? That was only talking about the godly soul. But there is a parallel on the animal soul level, and we discussed it in last week's lesson. That is the desire to live. The simple desire to live, when you boil it down to its simplest level, whether your life is, full of challenges or whether your life is the most enjoyable, everybody wants to live with a base instinct desire to survive. That comes directly from the animal soul's yearning for desire. So each of these apply twice to each person. Each person has an animal soul and a godly soul. And that, my friends, was the teaser for today's lesson. Why? You see, because this begs a question. If a human being is made up of 2 souls, and he has 2 sets of 10 attributes, and he has 2 sets of 3 garments, and he has 2 sets of deep level desire, right? The last 3 lessons that we learned. So then, pray tell, where does that come from? Why? If God only has 1 set, why do we have 2 sets? Where does this come from? Does God have 2 sets? Does God have 2 sets of 10 Sefirot? Does God have 2 sets of 4 worlds? Right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or on a simple level, we can ask ourselves, where did this animal soul come from? That's the simple question that is going to drive the entire lesson today. Okay, why 2 souls? How can the animal soul be an opponent? Where does it come from? And how is it stronger than the godly soul? If that's the one that's not paralleled in God's universe, why is the animal soul, at least by brute strength, stronger than the godly soul? So to solve this dilemma, of course, we are going to need to take a significant detour to sharpen our understanding of the 10 Sefirot. So let's go back to the 10 Sefirot. Everybody remembers them. They're here, the 10 Sefirot. And I want to call your attention to one aspect of the map. Right? On the map, you take a look at the 10 Sefirot. You have this on the screen. I don't know why I'm pulling it up close to my camera. You'll notice that each of the 10 Sefirot, each of these 10 attributes of God, is actually made up of 2 colors. It's divided into 2 colors. Why? That's because, according to the Zohar, each of these Sefirot is divided in half. There's 2 elements to each Sefirah. Ron, can you read for us about it a little bit? It's text 3, Atzilut, unity, on page 114.
The king is present within the 10 attributes of Atzilot. He and his vessels are one in that world, and he and his lights are one in that world.
Okay. If that wasn't a Kabbalistic statement for you, I don't know what's going to be. That was a good Kabbalistic statement, right? But the remainder of today's lesson is going to be to try and unpack this idea of the lights and the vessels, he and his vessels, if you will, and he and his lights. All right. So this is going to be some pretty interesting stuff. The overall theme of this reading is a point that was really discussed already at length in this course, and that is like this. Whereas Biyah, those bottom three worlds, I brought the map back up here so we can all follow. Biyah consists of worlds that sense themselves. Everybody remember that? They have their own identity. They have their own awareness. Atzilut, however, we said, does not. Atzilut is entirely godly. It's unified. In the world of Atzilut, he and his lights are one. Does everybody remember that? This idea that God, the king, and the 10 Sefirot, they're really all one. It was one of the reasons we brought that analogy 2 lessons ago of the paper, the white paper and the black, right? The black paper and the white words shining through them. It's not something new. The Sefirot are not something new. The Sefirot are just more God. Okay. However, we'll notice that in this text, in text 3, right, so the general theme of text 3 is just the fact that in the world of Atzilut, the Sefirot and God are all one. However, you start to get into details, you start to notice this concept of lights and vessels. What are lights and vessels? In Hebrew, they're called orot and kalim, and we'll soon introduce those as the next two key terms. But before we do so, let me just explain. In the language of Kabbalah, light means energy, abstract energy behind the given reality. A vessel means the structure that shapes and executes that energy into a particular form. As usual, it'll be helpful if we have some examples from our physical life, right? If you take a look on page 115 in your books, you will notice that there are 5 examples being given. Every single book that you've ever read, even the most silly book, not profound at all, has ideas that make up the book, right? That's what we would call the light of the book. What is the vessel? The vessel is the particular words that were chosen in order to communicate this light, in order to communicate these words to you. Let me explain. You could have used other words, right? The author could have chosen to use other words to express the same idea, especially if it's a parable. Then he could have chosen a whole different story in order to do that. But any book could choose other words, right? And it would express the same idea. It's why we have a phrase, an expression in English that says, in other words. What do we mean when we say in other words? Same idea, other words. Same light, different vessel. Same energy, different form. Melodies are the same way. Everybody knows that music is not just meant to keep your ears busy. It's meant to express a certain emotion. And every good song does express a certain emotion, right? Yes. But in order for that emotion to power through, it needs to have a certain form. And that is the musical notes. Every single melody, no matter how deep it pierces into your soul, and no matter how ripping apart and heartfelt it seems that it communicates emotions, talk to a musician, and they'll tell you, the whole thing is just made up of a whole bunch of zeros and ones, right? These are the musical notes. This is how you write it. And then you have that heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching song that moved you to tears, right? So there's a light, then there's the form, then there's the vessel. Same thing could be in business with a vision and a strategy. Same thing is true in a relationship. The love, obviously, is the burning desire, right, that each person has to be with each other. But then you have the action, right? The actions that there are that make up the relationship. Just because I have a burning desire and my wife has a burning desire doesn't mean we're actually in a relationship. There's actions that form a relationship. There's a structure to the relationship. You got to take out the trash. You got to buy a ring. You got to buy flowers, etc., right? Religion is the same way. The beliefs of the religion are what we would call the light, the abstract energy of the religion, and the vessel is the structure of it, the rituals, tefillin, Shabbat candles, all the different things that make up the structure of religion. I think one of the most powerful things you see in these examples is that actually, when you try and divide lights and vessels, at every level and with every object, they're going to look a little bit different, right? Why? Because depending on what you're discussing, the light and the vessel take on a little bit of a different meaning. What's always common, what the common denominator between all of them is that the light is going to be the abstract energy, and the vessel is going to be taking that abstract energy and forcing it to a certain form. By the way, we didn't give the most obvious example, which is when you have something in a vessel. Think of a cup. A cup is a physical vessel, right? The water has no form. It's just, it'll take the form of anything. But then you put it in a cup, put it in a bottle, and now it takes the form of that cup and bottle. Right? Okay. So when it comes to the lights and vessels in the world of Atzilut, obviously, as with everything, it's important to remove it from its physicality. We aren't talking about anything physical when discussing lights and vessels of the Sefirot, of these 10 Sefirot. So what are we talking about? What we're talking about is that when God chose to emanate from his infinite light, let's bring the slides back up here for a second. He wanted that infinite light to take 10 to take the form of 10 Sefirot. So therefore, he's shown 10 energies that were going to be the 10 Sefirot, right? But that was just raw power, right? This is conveyed, by the way, by the very name light. Remember in lesson 3, when we explored the concept of Or Ein Sof, the infinite light of God, one of the things that we discussed was that the reason we call it light is because just like light in this world is always connected with its source. If you see light, you immediately can trace it back to its source. You see rays of light, you can immediately trace it to the sun sets and the light immediately ceases. Same thing with electric light, same thing with a candle, same thing with a flashlight. So the same thing is true about the light of Hashem. Now, we said it then as a good thing. Oh, they're so godly. But it turns out that one of the big downsides to that is that when you're shining 10 raw energies, when you're shining 10 raw energies, 10 raw lights into the world, the problem is that now nobody can relate with him. Why? Because either they have to depart if they're going to become 10 Sefirot, 10 new entities, then it's going to be too much of a departure from their source. They're not going to be lights anymore, right? And if they don't, then they will never. Then there won't be actual Sefirot. So all you have so far is energy, 10 raw energies, and soon we're going to learn the purpose of the vessels. Let me just explain for a second. I'll give an analogy. I feel like I've given 10 already, but just by way of example. Imagine I think this comes from Dennis Prager, actually. I think this story comes from Dennis Prager. I think he said it as a real story. But imagine you're a young, you're a parent, and you're standing on the playground. You're watching you're watching from afar. You're watching your child play, and it becomes clear to you that a young boy hurt your child, heaven forbid. Obviously, you're very disturbed by this. But I think I would venture to say that the first thing you feel is emotion, not a particular emotion. The first thing you feel is raw energy, right? Why do I say that? I say that because it depends on the circumstances of the story. For example, let's say the boy that hurt your son is actually Down syndrome or autistic. There's a good chance that your strong, passionate emotion that you're feeling is going to channel itself into mercy or compassion for that boy. You know he doesn't know what he's doing with his hands. You know he's hitting, not from a place of anger, just his hands are just hitting, right? Sometimes that same energy, that same raw emotion you're feeling might channel its way into anger at the caretakers. Let's say the monitors who are supposed to be monitoring the children, counselors or teachers or mothers or what have you, it might channel its way into frustration with them. Why? Because it depends how your energy gets channeled. And that is the job of the vessels. So if you have this raw energy, these 10 raw energies coming from God, the vessel is the structure, the organization, the definition that light takes, right? So God shone forth, when he wanted to create Atzilut, he shone forth 10 unique, I wouldn't even call them unique, by the way. They're not unique really yet because they're not defined yet. He shone 10 energies, but they weren't formed. They weren't. They didn't get a definition until the 10 vessels. Together, these make up the 10 Sefirot. They make up the 10 Sefirot that we are familiar with. When the Oros are vested in Kalim, when the lights are vested in vessels, so then the result is the actual 10 Sefirot. Text 4a describes this. Where are we here? Elise, can you read for us, please? We're on page 116. Don't forget to unmute. Yes.
Okay. From abstract to defined. The light itself is in a state of simple abstractness. The vessel imposes a definition on the light, in the form of particular attributes of wisdom, kindness, and so forth.
Divine oros, divine lights, are generic rays of godliness. Without vessels, without structure and form, they produce nothing. It's only the two together, right, that together form an actual sephira. Let's talk about the opposite, by the way, right? What about just a vessel without light? You know what that's like? That's like somebody saying, you ever hear somebody saying words that sound like they should be heartfelt and emotional, but it's clearly devoid of any emotion? I think politicians are usually the best example of this, right? You hear them saying things, our thoughts and prayers are with you. You're like, keep your thoughts and prayers. That's not actual thoughts. But then you hear somebody else say the same thing, and it means it's very heartfelt. It's very emotional. You hear the emotion in it. The politician's words, saying words that could be emotional, but that aren't actually emotional, right? The politician's words are vessels devoid of any light in them. Okay? So that's why it's so important that for the Sefirot to become Sefirot, they have to work in tandem. They have to work together. Please turn your attention to the video screen for a summary of what we've studied so far, and then we'll pick it up from here. Oopa, I went a little too far. We did this one already. Yes, we get to watch it again.
Welcome to our fourth video on the world of Kabbalah, our journey through the mystical layers of the Kabbalistic system. Today, we'll analyze the Sefirot, which are actually a combination of two elements. The Kabbalists call them Orot, lights, and Kalim, vessels, spiritual containers or conductors for the divine light. Now, there's no electromagnetism in the spiritual heavens, so the terms lights and vessels are just metaphors. Light refers to the abstract divine energy behind any particular reality, and vessel refers to the structure applied to that energy to facilitate a specific function. Okay, that's a bit heavy, so let's use Benny as an example. Benny got beaten up at school, and Benny's dad is really disturbed, which, by the way, is a powerful but undefined energy. It is the light or force without any particular vessel or outlet. But Dad has several options. He could release it as frustration with the school, anger at the attacker, empathy, love, and guidance for Benny, compassion for a bully who needs emotional redirection, and so on. Those are all potential vessels for the same basic light. So the vessels of the Sefirot are 10 unique outlets for the same basic energy. They apply structure and definition that turn divine energy into chesed, love, gevura, discipline, tiferet, harmony, and so on. What if we kept the divine light but deleted its vessels? It would be like Dad feeling deeply disturbed at Benny's experience but having no ability to express or do anything about it. And what if we kept the vessels but deleted the light? It would be like Dad having the ability to react but lacking any motivation. In either case, there would be no reaction, no result. So this example helped us understand why the Sefirot are equipped with lights and vessels. But we've still got a problem. We refer to the divine abstract energy as light because it is constantly connected with its source, God Himself, just as sunlight is present only when the sun is present. Being intimately connected with God gives it a powerful appreciation for God. It longs to melt into God's infinite self and is utterly averse to being channeled into a limited structure. As for the vessels, they pull the other way. They're so addicted to structure that they have no patience for the abstractness of light. Talk about a personality clash. How can they ever fuse together? Simple. We're discussing the world of Atzilut, which is in tune with God's desire. It knows that the purpose of its existence is to create the finite worlds of Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So out of loyalty for God, the conflicting components of the Sefirot set aside their dispositions and work harmoniously to achieve the greater good of God's goals. That's good news for us for two reasons. One, it allows us to exist. Two, our souls are the great-grandchildren of the Sefirot of Atzilut. So we inherited the ability to set aside our personal dispositions to achieve the greatest good, whether it is to care for another, pursue a mitzvah act, or embrace our ethical responsibility.
I think I may have played the video just a drop too early. So the end of the video would not have been summarizing what we were talking about, but actually previewing, okay? You see, there's a second important feature that kalim, or vessels, introduce. What is that? Because of the light's desire to remain with the source, they always want to stay with the source. Remember we said that was the whole reason we used the word light, right? Because light always connected to its source. But because of that, when you tell light, now I want you to create something outside of your source, it's hard for light to do that. It's hard for the oros to do that. Why? Because the lights just want to go back to their source. So what do you need? You need vessels. Vessels are completely other focused. The whole reason that they're defined, the whole reason that they take on certain forms. So in addition to the benefit that itself has, that you now have 10 sefirot, you have definition because of the vessels, but in addition to that, the vessels actually help to be able to have a functional relationship with another. They help to be able to pass on to the next worlds. The three worlds of Biyah, Beriah, Yetzirah, Asiyah, owe their very existence to the vessels. Let me explain. Think about a relationship between two people, right? Husband and wife. They're so deeply in love with each other, right? That their love is all-consuming. A whole day they think about each other. They never experience anything else. They just think about each other, right? One of the downsides to such a relationship, as beautiful as it is that it's hard for them to actually be productive. Why? The husband goes to work. He cannot work. Why? Because all he's thinking about is his wife. All he's thinking about is this all-consuming love that he has for his wife, right? But an issue can be had also the opposite. You can have a husband who's too preoccupied with his work. He's too preoccupied with being functional that he doesn't spend time with his wife. He doesn't spend time with the all-consuming love, the relationship, etc. The vessels and the lights provide that balance. The two of them working in tandem allow for passing on to others. The vessels channel this idea of being 10 different sefirot, and therefore being able to pass on to the next world, therefore being able to pass on to the next one. Let's take a look at text 4b, which is on page 116. Jonathan, can you read for us, or you stepped away? Jonathan?
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay,
here.
you're good.
I was just trying to set up my computer here. Because I took picture. I'm traveling, so I took pictures of all.
Oh, okay. With text 4b, page 116.
Coming up.
Jonathan, next time if you're traveling, there might be a JLI chapter near you that you can join. Where are you?
I'm in Miami, Sunny Isles Beach.
There's Chabad rabbis in Sunny Isles giving the same course. It would be fun to pop into one.
That's a good point.
We have somebody joining us this coming Monday. I mean, not today, next week, from somewhere in New York, Westchester County or something, from a different rabbi who gives a course, and he's coming here. He's going to be in this area, and he's going to come to the lesson here.
Oh, well.
Anyways, go ahead. Text 4b.
Okay.
Able
4b.
to provide.
The lights of Atzilut, by their very nature, are abstract. They also aspire to return to their source and to become wholly subsumed within their sublime origin. Accordingly, they are far removed from creating the worlds of Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. Rather, the lights must first install themselves into the vessels of Atzilut in order to energize the creation of the worlds.
And that, my friends, is Oros and Kalim, right? Together, working together they actually communicate. They actually can create the lower worlds of Beriya, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Okay? And so here we have our next two key terms, Orot and Kalim, lights and vessels. Lights are the abstract divine energies that are closely tied to their source but are primed to produce divine attributes. And Kalim are the vessels, that the divine entities that actually receive that energy and are able to communicate it down to the lower levels. Now, if it isn't immediately apparent, I want to just point out that obviously both the Oros and Kalim, in order for them to marry, in order for them to be able to work in tandem and become the 10 Sefirot that we know, they need to go against, each one of them needs to go against their natural inclination. Let me explain. Lights would naturally rather be abstract. They would also rather be subsumed within their source. Think of a flame, right? Bring a small flame of a candle next to a torch, and immediately you'll see the flame wants to just become. It's ironic because it's against. It would cease to exist if it becomes part of the torch or of the bonfire or what have you. But if you bring it close, it will try to do that. That's lights for you. That's abstract energy. All it wants is to be reconnected with its source, to stop existing on an individual other level, right? On a self-aware level, etc. The Kalim, the vessels, want the exact opposite. They don't sense their source, and they're totally interested in what's happening below. They don't want to go up, they want to go down. They want to be defined, they don't want to be abstract, they want to be able to be something defined in order to be able to go on to the next one. So the question would be, how do these two work together? What causes them to work together? The answer is that it is indeed not natural, but text 4c explains the importance of bitul in this. I'm sorry, text 4c and 4d together. If I can ask Ron, if I can ask you to read for us, explains the problem and then the solution.
Lights and vessels are inherently opposites. The lights, by their very nature, are abstract. They also aspire to return to their source and to become wholly subsumed within their sublime origin. By contrast, vessels have a defined nature. They desire to retain their configuration and are naturally inclined to descend to lower realms.
Yet, when it comes to the world of Atzilot, on our map, we see there's 10 Sefirot, and they make one circle for each one. The Orot and the Kalim, the lights of the vessels, are working in tandem. Why? Go ahead, Ron, text 4d.
They are entirely submitted to God's intent for creation, namely that the universe should become an orderly habitat and not to be left in chaos.
Let's go back to that couple for a second that was deeply in love with each other, right? So suppose in a moment of deep love and connection, the husband notices that his wife very much desires that he go out and get her a bagel, right? He now faces a conflict. If he fetches the bagel, he'll be unable to be close to his love, right? He has to go away from her in order to give her the bagel. But what he really wants is to be close to her. So what's he going to do? If he's focused on what makes him feel good, then he's just going to stay next to her. Maybe get somebody else to get the bagel, etc. But obviously, if he's trying to be loyal to her, if he's actually there for her, for the other, for the ultimate purpose, which remember, when it comes to God, the purpose is to create the world. That's what Hashem is trying to do here. So then he will no doubt go out and get the bagel. Similarly, Oros and Kalim, lights and vessels, work in tandem only because of the ultimate desire of God, which is higher than all of them. Right? The higher desire of God requires the lights and vessels to collaborate in order to be able to create the world, in order to be able to create in order to be able to create ego, if you will, us, in order to explain us. Okay? All right. Everybody with me so far? In short, we've done half an hour. What we've done simply is explain that every single one of these 10 Sefirot, which so far we just knew as 10 different definitions of godliness, instead, we're saying it's a little bit more nuanced than that. There are lights and there are vessels. Everybody with me? That's it so far. Really, you don't need anything else. All of the understanding of lights and the vessels is extra. If you don't fully get it now, don't worry. You can always watch the recording and get that and do up until now again. All right? But why was all this important? All of this is important because we were trying to understand at the beginning of today's lesson, we asked a question. And the whole lesson today is based on this question. Are there two sets of Sefirot in God? In us, we know there are. We have two souls, a godly soul and an animal soul. Our question today is, are there two sets of Sefirot by God? And the answer is yes and no. It turns out that the whole world of Atzilot that we've been learning about, these 10 Sefirot, that was version 2, right? You know, when they release an app or they release a Microsoft Windows or they release whatever it is, there's always like an alpha and a beta. There's version 1 and then there's version 2.0, right? The world of Atzilot that we're familiar with, these 10 Sefirot, turns out that's version 2.0. There was a previous version that was unsuccessful, so to speak. And that first edition is what we call the world of chaos. Olam HaTohu. Where do these words come from? Turns out, as usual, it comes from the words of the creation of the world in Genesis. Elise Iser, if I can ask you to read for us, please. Text 5, primordial chaos. Elise, we cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
Oops.
There you go.
Okay.
Go
In the
ahead.
beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth was chaotic and desolate. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and God's spirit hovered over the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
The Kabbalists point to the words, the earth was chaotic and desolate. At least don't go anywhere yet. We're going to ask you to read text 6 as well. What does it mean the earth was chaotic and desolate? Say the Kabbalists, this refers to version 1.0 of Atzilut. The one before the one we're familiar with. Let's see how they divide this verse. Elise, can you read it for us, please? It's text 6. And you can follow
Okay.
this on your map if you'd like to.
Okay. The earth was chaotic and desolate. This refers to the breaking of the vessels. God's spirit hovered over the water. This refers to the lights that the vessels failed to absorb.
Okay. And it keeps going. It says, let there be light, right? The words let there be light, the Kabbalists say these words refer to the world of Atzilut, right? That's the words let there be light. But it turns out that before that, there was a period in which it was dark. It was desolate. That was prior. This is talking about the version 1.0 of Atzilut. What happened in between? In between, you had something called the breaking of the vessels. Okay, and that's what the rest of our lesson is going to be about today. Now, this is often called the cosmic error or the cosmic mistake. And I want to just take a moment to talk about those words before I actually use them. It's important to understand that this is Seder Ishtalshlut that we're talking about. This is the order of the way that God created the world. This is all divine in intent. As a result, even if we say that there was a mistake, even if we say that there was an error of some sort, or we use the word chaos to refer to that whole world, it's important to understand that this was by design. It was planned, it was directed, and desired. And I want to take a moment to talk about that. Later, I'm going to ask why. Why make a mistake if you don't plan to keep it that way? Like, why make a version 1.0? You would imagine that making a version 1.0 and a version 2.0 of something is a uniquely human feature, right? But it turns out that God himself, when he does it, he makes a version 1.0 and a version 2.0. Why? So that's a question we're going to deal with later, like 20 minutes from now. But for now, I just want to talk about the fact that it was not a mistake. And my favorite way of explaining this is that even when it comes to human beings, mistakes have their benefits. So we can start to see why God would intentionally design a mistake. I want you to think about, for example, they tell the story that there was a Microsoft employee. There was an employee of Microsoft, a highly paid employee, you know, way up the bureaucracy levels, who made a big mistake. And the mistake ended up costing the company over $1 million, right? So he came into work the next day, and he walks into Bill Gates' office, and he's ready. I mean, he wasn't going to hand in his resignation papers, but he figured, that's it, they're firing me today. He was called into Bill Gates' office. He thinks, okay, that's it. He's going to give me a little bit over the head. Why did you make such a stupid decision? The whole thing rests on his shoulders. He's going to fire me. And Bill Gates starts talking to him about the next project. He says, hold on a second, aren't you firing me? So he says, hold on a second. So Bill Gates looks at me and says, we just spent $1 million to teach you a lesson. And you think we're about to fire you? Right? We would waste $1 million on teaching you a lesson and then just fire you and have somebody else make the same mistake? No, there are lessons to be learned from the mistake. So similarly here, when we get in 20 minutes from now to answering the question, why the world of Tohu, which by the way has been a question we've been asking at every step of Seder Ishtalshlut, because all of this is by design. This is the way God created the world. It's important to understand that this mistake was on purpose. And only in a Kabbalah class can you hear a statement like that. This mistake was on purpose. Okay. With that, let's read an explanation of what happened in the world of Tohu. Phil Reutman, if I can ask you to read for us, please, text 7a.
The lights of Tohu were intense and powerful. They intensely desired to be nullified and subsumed within their emanating source. They had no sense of what their source wanted of them. As a result, they failed to deviate from their default nature for the sake of submitting to their greater purpose.
Here was the problem. You remember everything we've been talking about, Orot and Kalim? Everything we've been describing about the vessels and the lights? That was all explaining it the way it works in the world of Atzilut. In the world of Tohu, the one that preceded, the one we're familiar with. In version 1.0, it wasn't working. Why wasn't it working? Because all of the lights did not want anything to do with the vessels. They were acting naturally, as lights naturally act. There was no subservience to a higher cause, a higher mission, which was that God wanted to create the world. Instead, they all just wanted to be part of God's infinite light. And so what was left with, we were left with empty vessels. And you know what happens if you're left with empty vessels? Jack diddly squat. It's like back to the video for a second. It's like the parent who's left with a whole bunch of reactions, but no passion to do any of the reactions. So he doesn't do any of them. Imagine a human hand, for example, that isn't exposed to what the mind desires, right? And it's still a part of the person, but it fails to execute the mind's wishes. Why? Because there's no connection between the mind's desires and the fact that the hand is moving. Every time I move my hand, it's because my mind desires so. That's why I do so, right? Imagine a hand without that. Heaven forbid. This person is unhealthy. We don't encounter this in a healthy individual, but something similar happened in the world of Tohu. What happened? The lights were disconnected from God's ultimate purpose, right? The Orot, all they were doing was being selfish, and selfishly they wanted to just be part of God. They were like a couple that was totally in love, but totally dysfunctional. Nothing happening. The Oros, the lights, often the description that's used is they were too strong. They were too strong for the vessels. Right? They refused to become defined by the Sefirot. And wouldn't you know it? The Sefirot were suffering from a similar malady. What were they suffering from? Jonathan, if we can ask you to read, text 7b. We're on page 122. Reception.
Vessels. Reception denied. The vessels could not contain the light because they were not sufficiently submissive to pair with the light's intense abstractness. They acted like a wick resistant to the flame, resulting in the flame slipping away.
Thank you. In order for a wick to function, it has to be willing to be consumed, right? The vessels were not ready for that. They didn't want this heavy light coming and deciding what's going to happen, propelling them forward. Instead, they just want to be vessels on their own. They didn't, right? In order for Kalim to be Kalim, they need to be willing to be paired with something that's very different than them. You know the way I describe this? This is, the result is an unhappy marriage. Think about it. Very often in this physical world, we see symptoms of the same concept. What do we see? Very often people that are chaotic, they want to be married to somebody that's organized. And people that are organized, they want to be married to somebody chaotic. It's one of the funny fact that we see. Right? In English, sometimes we call it opposites attract, right? Other psychologists would say because they're trying to balance themselves out. This one feels like he's too organized, too structured. He wants a little more excitement in his life. The other one feels like, I don't know why I decided that was the man and this was the woman, but either way, we're going with it. The woman feels like she's too chaotic. She's too excited, too passionate. She wants a little more structure in her life, and that's what he's going to provide, and therefore they get married to each other, right? But here's the thing. Imagine if two people get married to each other, one chaotic and one organized. And every time the chaotic person tries to add a little more zest to the organized person's life, or every time the organized person tries to add a little more organization to the chaotic person's life, they reject each other. You end up with a terribly unhappy marriage. Why? Because they're butting heads a whole day, a whole night. This is what happened in the world of Tohu. It was like an unhappy marriage. You have vessels, you have lights, but they refuse to be married to each other. They want nothing to do with each other. So the lights are refusing to be contained by a vessel, and the vessels didn't want to serve the light. And this is why, back to the text, these words, Veruach Elokim Merachefet, the words that mean the Spirit of God was slipping, sliding away, that's a reference to the broken vessels. That was the result of what happened with the world of Tohu. The vessels broke. The lights slipped back to their source. The vessels were destroyed. And as a result, nothing worked. Okay. Right, the vessels ceased being receptacles, the lights stood back to their sources, and that was that. This is what we call, which is just a little repetitive what we were saying earlier. This is what we call, key term 4.5, the world of Tohu. Okay, a system in which the lights and the vessels did not work. Why? Because the lights were overpowering the vessels. So what was the result? The result was key term 4.6, Shavirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. When the vessels no longer lend definition to the lights, but become standalone entities, obviously a vessel without any light in it, useless, right? Beautiful. To highlight the contrast of this, the world that we have today, the Atzilut, the 10 Sefirot that we have today, in contrast to the world of Tohu, the world of chaos, which then resulted in the breaking of the vessels, there's another word that we use for Atzilut. And what is that? That is the world of Tikkun. Tikkun is the opposite of Tohu. Tikkun is the world as it is supposed to be when the lights and vessels are both subservient to God's ultimate mission, God's ultimate desire to create the world, and therefore they work in tandem. And that's our next key term. Tikkun. Tikkun is the world of correction, right? Or as we would call it in modern terms, Atzilut 2.0. In this world, the lights and vessels are working in tandem. They're working beautifully together. And as a result, we can actually have the world of Atzilut with its 10 Sefirot as we know it. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to Seder Ishtalshalut, nothing is by chance, right? So the big question we really need to ask now is, why? If God did this on purpose, if this was necessary in order to create the world, what was the reason for it? Why did God emanate a Tohu, a world of chaos, a version 1.0, if he knew it's not going to last? There's going to be a version 2.0. Right? Now we can ask this, by the way, at every step of the way of Seder Ishtalshalut, at every step of the way of this map, we can ask that question. But specifically today, when we're learning about Tohu, Tohu is being called by a name that means chaos. As we're describing it, we're almost describing it in past tense, even though, as noted before, everything is really happening simultaneously at every moment. But we're describing it in past tense because that's not the one that exists today. That's not the 10 Sefirot we're familiar with. That's not the 10 Sefirot that define our world, that our world is made up of. It's a previous iteration that doesn't exist. So then, what we're left with is, for some reason, Hashem wanted this mistake, so to speak, to be in the collective experience of the world before it moves on to the 10 Sefirot. Why? I think the best explanation is, the best way of understanding this is, excuse me, is by appreciating that this happens in human beings all the time. Why? Human beings all the time will reference previous mistakes in their life, moments in their lives that if you would have chosen beforehand, you wouldn't have chosen to go through that pain. Let's say somebody went through a divorce and now is happily married. Goes through a divorce, 3 years he's married to someone, goes through a very painful divorce, and then gets married a second time. And then is married 30 years happily to that person. Usually when you talk to these people, they say, listen, I never would have chosen to experience that divorce, but I wouldn't trade that experience for anything in the world. And you can translate this into whatever version you have in your life. Often we have two versions of something, and I think that if we were given the choice, this is really how we would choose it. I wish I could have the experience of those 3 years, the experience of that painful divorce, the growth that came with those 3 years without the actual pain of it, without actually having experienced it. In other words, the four worlds as we know them today, Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, those four dimensions are built on the background, against the background of the vessels, the broken vessels, the learned mistake of what happens when Orot and Ketim, when lights and vessels don't work together in tandem. Why? Because when that happens, we know that we have this past exposure. We know that we have this past exposure that teaches us that the vessels and lights have to be together. And as a result, our world actually stays intact. The sense of God, and not only that, what it really leads to is, it leads to that even while we are in this world, we are aware that we are in this world because God's presence is being held back. Let me explain that again. We have a slide. I think this will hopefully be a little helpful. The kalim of Tohu, right? The vessels of the broken vessel, those broken vessels, the leftovers of this version 1.0, right? They actually still wield their influence in our world today. Why? Because they provide an alternate option, an option of not working together. They provide an example of what happens when we're out of sync, right? They provide an example, they provide an experience, a lived knowledge, if you will, for our world of what happens when everything is out of sync, when there is a world of chaos. Now, there's a lot of things in this world, okay, that find their source in this out of sync world, from the broken vessels. They come from the broken vessels. But for the purpose of our conversation today, the most dramatic example of this, of something that's disjointed from godliness, something that's not following the overall desire of God, is us. Inside us, every single one of us has a part of us that finds its roots in the broken vessels. And wouldn't you know it, that is the animal soul. The animal soul, the reason that it can oppose the will of Hashem is because it has a lived experience of something that opposes the will of Hashem, and that's why it was out of sync. That's why it was chaotic. That's also why it's so strong. This is the source of the animal soul. Let's let the Alter Rebbe introduce it to us himself. Ron, if you can read for us, please. Text 8, page 125. These two different sources, the world of chaos and the world of correction, the world of Tohu and the world of Tikkun, result in two souls inside every single one of us. Go ahead.
We are comprised of both Tohu and Tikkun. Our godly souls are produced of Tikkun and are therefore inherently subservient to God. Our animal souls and bodies are products of the broken vessels of Tohu. Although inanimate objects, plants, and animals are also linked with Tohu, the concept of separation from God is far more pronounced in humans. That is because all other things cannot sin and therefore do not become completely separated from God. Humans, by contrast, on account of our bodies and animal souls, are capable of sin and consequently are becoming far more separated from God.
This is a very powerful idea. We wondered earlier why we have two souls. What was the origin of our two souls? It turns out it's directly rooted in Tohu and Tikkun. So anytime you have somebody, whether they are totally not in tune with their godly soul and only in tune with their animal soul. So think, for example, the ultimate evil that you know of in this world, the fact that Hamas operatives can come to the Hamas terrorists can come into Eretz Yisrael and murder people in cold blood in the most evil and sadistic way possible. Where does the allowance for such evil in this world come from? It comes from Tohu. What does Tohu mean? A world of chaos, a world that can deny godliness, a world that can say, sure, God wants the world to exist, but I want to do whatever I want to do. I'm out of sync. That ability comes from the world of Tohu. And in us, that is represented in our animal soul. Everything else, everything being in sync with God, the fact that Israel exists to begin with, the fact that Jews in Israel are sitting and serving Hashem and doing amazing things and transcending themselves in order to do a favor, that comes from the world of Tikkun. Sorry for giving such a relevant example today, but I think we're beginning to see the difference between these two worlds. It turns out there's actually a lot of details in the difference between our animal soul and our godly soul that are directly related to the difference between Tohu and Tikkun. Let's go through some of them right now. Number one, the chronological order. I don't know how many of you know this, But the more you study Kabbalah and the more you study Hasidus, it becomes clear that the animal soul exists within a human being from the moment they exit their mother's womb. Really before that, but let's start there, right? And your animal soul is there in its full force then. This is why whenever I describe to people that the animal soul is not only bad, it's mainly the best definition of it is selfish, not bad. Why? Because think about it. The ultimate selfish human being in this world is who? A baby, right? Do you know any other being that as soon as it wants food, everybody else needs to stop whatever they're doing and bring it food? Because otherwise it'll scream its head off without any consideration for anybody else around it. If it wants to sleep, it'll yell its head off and nobody else in the house can sleep besides for it, right? It's totally self-centered. And what happens? As a baby goes till bar bat mitzvah, the godly soul slowly begins by a girl at birth and by a boy at the circumcision. It slowly begins to enter from then, leading all the way up till bar and bat mitzvah, 12 for a girl and 13 for a boy. And at that age, the godly soul fully enters the body. Isn't it interesting? The animal soul is present first. The godly soul is late to the game, and Johnny come lately, right? Why is this? This is because their sources are the same way. The world of Tohu is first, and the world of Tikkun was later. Now let's look at some of their characteristics. The world of Tohu, what was the issue? Why did it explode? Because it was totally self-centered. The lights were self-centered. The vessels were self-centered. None of them wanted to work together with somebody else. That's exactly what our animal soul is about. All of the drives in us that lead us to go do what we want and not what somebody else come from the animal soul. Non-cooperation. The godly soul, totally mission-oriented. Like its name suggests, it wants only what God wants. Think of the difference between the animal soul and godly soul in terms of loyalty, right? The godly soul has no desire of its own. All it wants is God's desire. Loyal to the mission, even if that means putting myself on the side. The animal soul doesn't care about any loyalty to Hashem or to any higher power. Sometimes the animal soul prompts us to deviate from God's will. And as we read in text 8, what happens? That's out of sync, on steroids. It's out of sync with who we ourselves want to be. On the other hand, the godly soul, right, completely sorry, I meant to explain a different idea. When you do that, when a person leads a life only animal soul, selfish oriented, what happens? He walks around like a broken vessel. Think about it. You know people like this. They walk around their whole life. All they want is another car, another house, animal soul, animal soul, animal soul, animal soul. Give me more, give me more, give me more, give me more. Eventually, you look at this person, you say, you're empty, you're broken, right? But somebody who has nothing in this world, we call them complete. Why? Because if their mind is in the right place, they're leading a meaningful life. They are complete vessels. Again, these symptoms, these characteristics take themselves directly from the worlds of Tohu and the world of Tikkun. And finally, in terms of power, the world of Tikkun is less powerful. You know why? Because it's choosing to temper itself in order to allow itself to complete a higher mission. The world of Tohu, unbridled power. It's just power, 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 right? Why? Because that power is not tempered, it's not channeled, it's not defined in any sort of way. And that's why the power of the Nefesh Bahamid, the power of the animal soul, like we said, you remember what we said earlier? That the animal soul is more powerful, but it's less focused, right? The animal soul will drive you that even though it's raining, you'll show up for the Rose Parade, show up for the Rose Bowl, but it's less focused. It's just all over the place. And actually, one of the ways of looking at our purpose in life, the purpose of the creation of the world, is to look at it in this way. Why did my neshama come down into this world? In order for the godly soul to temper the animal soul. In order to channel that energy. Not to ignore that energy, not to somehow abstain from that energy, to use that energy and harness it for something powerful. Think of an ox or a cow, right? They're very powerful. They can do amazing things. All you need is a yoke that keeps it in check. This is what we're supposed to be doing. This is what we're not supposed to be doing. The Arizal explains in text 9. Phil, I think. Text 9, on page 126.
All of the mitzvot are designed exclusively to purify the animal soul and mortal body. By contrast, the divine soul does not require rectification. It has no intrinsic need to become installed within an animal soul and mortal body. The sole purpose for doing so is for it to illuminate and rectify them. Understand this well. The reason the soul descends to this world is to rectify and purify.
The animal soul is a godly force which has lost touch with itself. It's not a bad force. It's a good force. It has just lost touch with itself. This soul can be restored to its original settings. It can actually be made to be harnessed for godliness. And how do we do this? So he said in the text, it's a mitzvah, right? But why? Why does a mitzvah do this? Because what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is a higher desire of God. It's a higher will. It's a will of Hashem that comes down and says, okay, let's see if you two can work in tandem. Let's see if the godly soul can harness the animal soul only for this purpose. And when it does so, right? So you have somebody, for some reason, his animal soul wants him to make millions and millions and millions of dollars. All he needs is to take that energy to make money and channel it into an energy to give a lot of tzedakah. What's happened now? Now he's in sync with a higher power. Now it's that same power of the ox, the power of the animal soul, channeled through a vessel to serve Hashem. Text 10 is a wild story. It's just a fun story. I think many of you will do well if you, instead of thinking of the language Yiddish, if you think of the language English. Jonathan, you want to read for us, please? Text 10. We're on page 127.
Rabbi Gershon Ber of Bahar deeply understood Hasidic philosophy and was a man of few words. Nevertheless, he had a habit of translating everything into Yiddish. I heard him counting the Omer on the first night, translating each Hebrew word into Yiddish as he did so. He did the same on each subsequent night of the Omer, translating everything into Yiddish. He once asked Rabbi Peretz, the rabbi of Nevel and later of Chernigov, whether it was permissible to translate every prayer into Yiddish, including portions of the prayer during which one is forbidden to make an interruption. Rabbi Peretz asked, "Why would you want to do that?" He responded, "My animal soul understands Yiddish better."
The purpose of the godly soul is in order to tame the animal soul. So if your animal soul speaks English better, right? Often I daven, I'll have like the English, trust me, I know how to read Hebrew. And not only that, Hebrew is my, it's a language that I understand very well. But if you want to be able to actually talk to yourself, sometimes it's worth it to have the English translation next to you. Why? Because you're not talking to your godly soul. He already knows God is one. He already knows that all he wants to do is mitzvah. So all he wants to do is come to minyan, etc. No, you're talking to the guy that in 40 degrees rain would stand at the Rose Bowl Stadium and cheer for his team. That's who you're talking to. You want to harness that energy. And if he speaks English, you got to talk to him in English, right? This is also why tikkun, this correction of the power of the animal soul, the power of Tohu, the power of the chaotic world, should never be limited only to mitzvot. It should extend to every area, every facet of life. Elise, if you can read for us, please, text 11. In all ways.
Okay. Okay, in all ways.
Yeah.
Do not assume that the only time we are close to God is while we are engaged in Torah study, prayer, and the performance of a mitzvah, and that we have turned away from God while engaged in earthly endeavors such as eating, drinking, and other needs. This is not the case, for we are instructed, know God in all of your ways. We can connect with God through every endeavor.
And if I bring in 1983, the Rebbe actually spent some time using some examples of this. The two examples the Rebbe gave were of an attorney and an engineer, right? He took time to explain how these two fields can be used specifically in serving Hashem. Think of an attorney, right? An attorney's primary pursuit is searching for evidence that will exonerate his client. It doesn't make a difference if he's guilty or innocent, right? He looks for evidence that will exonerate his client. Whatever the circumstances and however flimsy the case, the lawyer puts all his efforts to build a defense. This teaches a Jew that in order that we should attempt to find everything that's good and worthy in a fellow Jew. That we should be able to look at another Jew, and even if technically they're guilty, we should be able to see the good within them. That's one way we can see, we can use the animal soul, we can use a seemingly very selfish pursuit in order to serve Hashem. What about an engineer? Similarly, what is an engineer's job? An engineer designs machines, many parts, some of them are more important, some of them are less important. A layperson can mistakenly assume that the device can still operate if one screw is removed or an extra thing is added or whatever. But an engineer knows better. He knows that every single detail is important. Again, this metaphor can be applied to the fulfillment of mitzvah. A person should resist the urge to say, I'm going to do the mitzvah, but I'm just eliminating this part because I don't feel like it, or because it's too much of a schlepp, or because it's too expensive. We should be aware that every deletion and every change, which may seem insignificant to us, is crucially important to the mitzvah. What was the Rebbe doing during this Farbrengen? The Rebbe is attempting to teach us that in every area of life that technically belongs to the animal soul, this is our job. Our job is to always be stealing territory from the animal soul. The animal soul thinks, this is my job. This is a good steak. This is a football game. This is my one break that I get from the godly soul. Comes a Jew and says, no, every single element of our lives has to be used to serve Hashem. And you know what happens then? Something unique transpires. Once the animal soul joins forces with the godly soul and feels an attraction to spirituality, then it can utilize the power. Remember we said the animal soul is more powerful? To generate much more passion for God than the godly soul could have done all on its own. Take a look at text 12. Ron, would you bring it home for us?
Okay, let's see. The animal soul is tremendously powerful due to its lofty source. Consequently, although it has fallen far below, it continues to generate far greater passion than the godly soul can produce on its own.
The intense Tohu power that normally is relegated to animalistic urges can now direct its intensity towards holy purposes. And that's powerful, my friends. In there lies the purpose of creation. Every time we do that, we take that power, and what we do is, excuse me, we transform that power. We use that power for holiness, in that way, connecting it with Hashem in an unbelievable way. We are now going to do our weekly meditation. And I'd like to encourage, there we go. How do I pause it? All right. And I'd like to encourage every single one of you that during this meditation, take a few minutes, we're going to play a niggin, a Hasidic melody, and take a moment to think about, to identify a part of your life that you think of as selfish. Your moment when you're watching TV, your job, your this, your that to you is only selfish. And think about how you can transform, how you can use that, that talent, that moment, that activity to actually serve Hashem.
ay, 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 ay.
My friends, if we can take a moment to actually harness our animal souls to serve Hashem, then we can actually have a lot more power in our serving Hashem. And I'd like to conclude with the following story. There was a chassid in the times of the Alter Rebbe, in the times of the first Chabad Rebbe, who had a son, and his son had veered off of the path of Hasidus, the path of Judaism, and was pursuing his own wild path. And one of the ways that this expressed itself, don't ask me why, but in those days, I guess, riding a horse was not considered proper Hasidic etiquette. So it's one of the many ways that he expressed his independence and his obviously riding a horse then wasn't like it is today. I guess it's like the equivalent of me riding a Lamborghini. There's nothing technically wrong about it. It doesn't say in the Torah you're not allowed to ride a Lamborghini. For a rabbi, I think I'm revving up to the parking lot of a Lamborghini, clearly not showing the most refined side. Okay. Either way. So the chassid was at a loss of what to do, so he tells the Alter Rebbe about his son, and I don't even know if he mentioned it to the Alter Rebbe, but he had his son come for a private audience with the Alter Rebbe, and his son agreed. So sure enough, he comes to the Alter Rebbe's study, and he comes to a private audience with the Alter Rebbe, and he arrived on horseback. So the Alter Rebbe said to him, he said, "How did you get here?" So he said, he was rebelling, he was independent. So he said, "I came riding on a horse." The Alter Rebbe said to him, "And why do you like riding on a horse?" So he said, "I like riding a horse because it's so much faster. It gets you to where you need to get to much quicker." So the Alter Rebbe said, "That's true." Then the Alter Rebbe said to him, "Yeah, but let me point something out. If the horse rides much quicker than any other form of transportation, then isn't it also true that if you're on the wrong path, going in the wrong direction, you will go much faster in the wrong direction?" So the young man turned to the Alter Rebbe and he said, "Yeah, what's the big deal? As soon as I realize I can turn the horse around and go fast back and correct my error and go back in the right direction, even faster than I would have gone without it." So the Alter Rebbe looked at him and said, "As soon as you realize, huh?" And in the Alter Rebbe's unique, curing and straightforward fashion, the Alter Rebbe repeated these words over and over again. He said, "As soon as you realize, as soon as you realize." It was at that moment that this young man fell into a deep faint. Why? Because the words of the Alter Rebbe penetrated him. He realized what the Alter Rebbe was telling him. The horse was a metaphor for his life. Sure, it's true that a horse can make you go faster. Strong power, passion. It can take you all the way through to climb the ranks of Olam Hazeh, to climb the ranks of this materialistic world, all the way to the top. Before you know it, a multi-billionaire, and anything you want in this world is yours. The problem is you're down the wrong path. But when you realize that you're down the wrong path, and you turn around and you use that same passion, that same horse, that same energy, that same speed to take you in the right direction, you can make that correction even quicker than other people and surpass it much more. This is the secret. This is the key of channeling the power of the world of chaos, the world of Tohu, but making that tikkun, making that correction to allow it, harnessing it for positivity, harnessing it for spirituality. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a brief summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 4. The World of Chaos. 1. There's no reason to be overly impressed or intimidated by the strong desires of the animal soul. The fact that it shouts louder does not make it more genuinely you. It's more forceful simply because of its chaotic Tohu origin. 2. The performance of a mitzvah and immersive prayer transform the animal soul into a receptacle for God's light. Additionally, we can infuse spirituality into those areas of life within the domain of the animal soul. This turns the animal soul into a vessel for a higher purpose, which is an act of tikkun. 3. If we ignore the godly soul, we remain unfulfilled. If we grant it what it desires without linking it to the animal soul, we remain fragmented. Only when we allow the godly soul to influence the animal soul and to infuse it with direction do we introduce harmony to our lives.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 4. the world of chaos. I look forward to seeing you all next week for lesson 5, the Great Concealment. As a note, just make an announcement. Next week's lesson is not sponsored yet. You are available to do so. Please let me know. Or if you want to join in as a co-sponsor, that's also a possibility. Thank you very much to everybody. And thank you, Ron and Mickey, for sponsoring today's lesson.
Thank you, Rabbi.